I study a lot of American and British locomotives. Don't get me wrong, there's been times I've studied others, but something that I don't really know much about are Japanese locomotives, specifically their steam locomotives. I know that 9 times out of 10 they're visually appealing, but that doesn't really help much, and recently I've wanted to expand that interest. I figured I would finally start with my first official Japanese locomotive, and what better to start with than the locomotive that Hero is based on, the J&R Class D51. Or more specifically, I guess, the D51-23 by MicroAce. Today we'll be not only learning about this locomotive, but also taking a look at one. So, the Class D51 is a type of 282 steam locomotive, and was built by the Japanese government railways, the Japanese national railways, even Kawasaki and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, from 1936 to 1945 and 1950 to 1951. The locomotive was not only used in Japan, however, and would also see service on Soviet railways, Korean national railways, Manila railways, as well as Taiwan railways. In Japan, there was about 1,115 produced, 37 in Taiwan, 10 in the Philippines, and 2 in Korea. In length, the locomotive was close to 65 feet long, weighed 75.6 long tons, 84.7 short tons, and had a maximum speed of 55 miles per hour. They would be retired between 1956 and 1983, with the last one being retired in Taiwan. Currently, there are 174 preserved, 3 that are operational in Japan, 2 were apparently dumped in Russia, and 4 are currently preserved in Taiwan. The design of the Class D51 was based on the earlier D50, which was introduced in 1923. During wartime production, wood would be substituted for steel parts like running boards, or even smoke deflectors, as well as tinder coal bunkers, which definitely would have been interesting to see. And the D51s themselves had the largest number of any single class in Japan. Early D51s were nicknamed Namakujigata, or slug form, for their shape. The locomotive was designed by Hideo Shima, and was mainly used in freight service through the 1960s. Also, apologies if I said any of that wrong. The model itself that we'll be taking a look at today is also a Namakujigata. As you'll soon see, it looks like a slug. Or, in my opinion, maybe like a shark. I like to call him Bruce because he reminds me of the one from Nemo. And as you can see here, it comes packaged like most in-scale locomotives do. This packaging is very reminiscent of Kato and Tomitech, even Bachmann. It's the hard plastic covering that separates on top and gives you access to the locomotive. On the back, there's actually an illustration of the locomotive, as well as what I believe is a description of the locomotive, but unfortunately, I cannot understand that. Hopefully, the beginning of this video helped with that a little bit. And don't let what I said fool you. This packaging is great. This really keeps the locomotive safe, and it's great for packing it back up. It's just honestly kind of typical. So with that being said, let's go ahead and open this guy up and take a look at the locomotive itself. So my first impressions of this locomotive were nothing but good. First of all, this locomotive is quite heavy, especially for an in-scale locomotive. There isn't a lot of separately fitted details, but there are some present, and honestly the detail that is molded does look pretty great. Unfortunately, I believe I spot a dummy coupler on the front, which does stink a little bit, but I believe this thing comes with a spare coupler anyway, and that shouldn't be too hard to fix. The tinder itself is attached to the locomotive as well, and the motor itself sticks out of the back of the cab, which unfortunately looks a bit jarring, but really isn't that big of a deal. When it's running, I'm sure it won't be too noticeable. But let's get a closer look at this guy. Let's start with taking a look at this thing next to James. As previously, James was my largest in-scale locomotive. As you can see here, that is no longer the case. In terms of length, the Tomix James is beaten out pretty quickly, which makes sense. This is a 282 locomotive. But surprisingly, the Tomix James ends up being a bit taller, which honestly is expected. The Tomix Thomas range is known to be a bit out of proportion. I have to say, this locomotive is probably one of the most impressive I've seen in scale so far. Most of its detail is molded, like I said, but the separately fitted detail that is there is very nicely done, being handrails and several other smaller parts. The coal load inside of the tinder, while being a bit shiny, does look quite realistic, and the locomotive itself is painted a matte black and detailed with gold, which you can see on the number plates and sides. While it does stink that the cab itself is filled up with the motor, they did still simulate windows on the cab itself. And something that I find a bit odd is the rod assembly. On the front here it appears to be plastic, but the back of it appears to be metal. I couldn't tell you exactly why that is, but it is something that I noticed. And yes, just to confirm, the coupling on the front is a dummy coupler, but one that is very easily replaced. Something that I'll probably do after this video. Now, another cool feature of this locomotive is it has a working headlamp, which out here is a bit hard to see. Here's a better look at that. But what stinks is the Tinder itself only has a simulated tail lamp, and with this locomotive retailing for anywhere between $120 to $160, I really don't think that would be too hard of a feature to implement, especially if it's already molded onto the back, and the Tinder is attached to the locomotive with pickups. Oh, also, yes, the Tinder does have pickups as well. I forgot to mention that. So on turnouts, this guy should perform just fine. Now, this particular design of D51 is one of the older designs. This is before they would give it a lamp generator, a completely different dome. Again, this thing looks like a slug. But the reason this locomotive looks like this is because it's streamlined. There are multiple dome variants on the D51. This is just one, and one that I thought looked pretty interesting. And if you guys are interested, there are several other different types of D51s that you can get from Tomitech and other brands. This one just happened to catch my eye, and you can see why. So now that we've talked about all of that, let's go ahead and see this guy in action. This review was a little bit different. Not only was it on an N-scale locomotive, but a Japanese one. And up until this point, I've never actually owned a Japanese locomotive. But through finally starting to research them, I quickly became obsessed with them. And honestly, this interest can only grow. So if you guys would like to see more of these, be sure to let me know down in the comments. I also don't want to stop with just Japanese locomotives. If there's any other basis or class that I should check out, comment down below and I'll do my best to take a look at them. But in terms of this locomotive, I have to give this model an easy 8 out of 10. The only thing stopping it from having a perfect score being the lack of a tail lamp and the fact that the cab is taken up by the motor. If it weren't for those two minor details, this locomotive would be perfect. But unfortunately, with them being present, it does hamper the model a little bit. But honestly, not too much. This has to be one of my favorite N-scale locomotives that I've ever had the chance to look at. And if you guys have a chance to pick one up for yourself, I highly recommend you do. Just make sure you have a larger radius. You don't want to run this guy on some Kato compact curves. As always, thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.